Richard, thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
I understand that you have a short intro for us on blockchain and how it's used in your platform. Where's my clicker?
Yeah, let's use the clicker.
There we are. So let's get started with that and then come back to our discussion a little bit later.
Yeah, I just wanted to give some context about what we're doing and how we're using blockchain just in the early stages. So as you mentioned, we're partnered with NASDAQ, and we're bringing their NASDAQ financial framework to advertising. And what that means for us is a bunch of things, one of which is blockchain, of course, but we'll get to that a bit later. The primary use case that we're bringing forward is around trading of media contracts as opposed to impressions. We do that as a primary use case. There's others that could come. We've seen that the trading, retrading of RTB, essentially real time, is proliferated, but there's still some gaps, frankly, in the forward market, in the kind of direct sales market that's happening today. So we're focused there, and to enable us to get access to real-world information and really start to kind of utilize blockchain at the core of our exchange. So we've spent the last, since 2016, when we formed the relationship with NASDAQ, customizing their exchange, and for advertising, we've got some patents and various other things that we're doing with those guys. So to kind of get into a little bit about what we're doing on the blockchain side, we saw a bunch of challenges in the industry around transparency and particularly around security of information, which we'll get into a little bit later in the use cases. So our first use case, while not necessarily the purest form of the use of a blockchain, it's one that we can get real-world experience. We heard this morning about actually working with real-world experiences and testing and learning and failing fast. And that's very much the ethos that we came from. So we've installed blockchain as our core ledger. So we store the trades that happen between the buyer and the seller. We store the transactions that happen downstream. And we store basically as much as we can on the chain so that when we get to a point where it gets distributed and our customers and our partners are ready to engage with blockchain, that the data will be available in a form which could be usable. So to get a little bit down to some of the other characteristics, and I guess we can get a little bit more into this in the conversation, we also see that because the blockchain gives the ability to give access to counterparties, they can really see the full audit trail. So that's another characteristic that we liked. And as the core of our exchange is a contract entity, right, rather than an impression, we also see eventually that the native asset that's stored on a blockchain is essentially the rules that were decided between buyer and seller on the exchange, so that this can be executed in an automated way in the future when other people are ready to engage with that. So one of the things that I want to mention here about blockchains, and another reason why we chose to use it, is we've seen from the world go through this kind of internet basically has been able to exchange information. Like that's been the core innovation, if you like, that the internet's brought in the last years. And what blockchains promise is changing that conversation from being about information to being about transfer of value, right? And that's something that I'll talk about a lot as we step through. So I'll leave it there for now, and we can get into the conversation a bit more. Okay.
I have a question for the audience, actually. I would like to poll you. So raise your hand if you have heard of blockchain before today. Wow. Nice, pretty much everybody. Now, raise your hand if you feel like you really know how blockchain works. Yeah, Christian. And a couple of our tech guys in the audience. Excellent.
I've done quite a few of these sessions in the last 6 months, and that's very similar across the globe.
So it seems to me like blockchain is kind of this year's buzzword, a little bit like big data of a couple of years ago. So let's talk about what exactly is blockchain, what is it not, and why are people saying that it's going to revolutionize the ad industry?
So there's a kind of very technical view, and then there's a a more business level view that I like to bring to this question. So the technical view is it's essentially a way of securing a ledger in a distributed or decentralized way. Right? So what that means is typically today, centralized parties like banks or middlemen in advertising or whatever the instantiation is on the internet essentially control the database, control that information. What blockchain enables is that to be distributed, and it also enables that to be secure and trusted by participants, all participants in that network. Right, so that's a more technically skewed way. What that ultimately ends up enabling on the web, which we've been lacking ever since the web was introduced, is a way for people to trust each other in the transfer of value that happens, right? Whether it be money transfer, whether it be some kind of value transfer for advertising for a product, or whether it be consuming content and ultimately end up monetizing that content distribution for advertisers. There's lots of use cases. That's really why I think people see this is potentially changing the way things are done just in general on the internet. So that's we can dig in a little bit on either side there. I think this idea of a distributed ledger technology also is with everything that's going on in advertising right now, with fees being obfuscated, with GDPR. There's some very salient use cases that blockchains can help with, which are things that I want to share as we enter this conversation.
So, in terms of what's concretely being done right now, aside from your platform, what else is out there? Is there anybody else that's already implementing blockchain technology to solve problems in the ad space?
Yes, there are.
Let's talk about it.
There's quite a few. So I'd say, first of all, that it's very early. Right, so there's different profiles of companies. I'm co-chairing the blockchain working group inside the IAB, so I get access to a lot of the activity that happens, particularly in the United States. And there's companies which are focusing on securing user data. There's companies that are focusing on the verification of impressions that are happening in various parts of the ecosystem. Some of them are very focused on a particular subset of the ecosystem, whether it be out of home or TV or some subset. And there's a few other use cases around, this one's a little bit too early in the advertising space, but there's a lot of use cases around you and I as users or personas or consumers on the web being able to control access to our data and actually receive value for that. So there's quite a few companies. In the US, there's probably 10 companies which are putting a lot of effort and are certainly marketing themselves a lot. And there's obviously a lot more under the surface which haven't bubbled up yet. But I will just say that advertising has come late to this party, right? This is something that the foundation of blockchain was the original instantiation was Bitcoin, and that's 10 years old. So when you think about the stage we're at and the number of companies that are involved, it's still super early. It's still very early.
And as I understand, the core benefit of blockchain in and of itself is the fact that it's very secure and that it's very transparent. Those are the two words you always hear: secure, transparent, secure, transparent. What is it about blockchain that makes it so secure and transparent?
Well, so the distributed nature of the ledger is what makes it transparent, or it gives the opportunity for it to be transparent. We should dig into that one a little bit, because the Bitcoin blockchain is super transparent in the sense that if you understand the kind of identifier that is you or me on that blockchain, you can see all of the transactions that have been made between every party on the whole network, right? It's a very open ecosystem in that sense. So the transparency, we have to think about this a lot in advertising, particularly because we don't necessarily want all transactions, all the data that's been everything that's happening between buyer and seller, right? We don't necessarily want all of that open to anyone, right? So we have to think about how we can you know, show transparency to the right parties, right? And make sure that what's transparent is not breaking any rules, right? Because, you know, sellers don't necessarily want to share their pricing with everybody, right? And buyers don't necessarily want to do the same, do the deals that they've got with everybody. So there's a kind of, the transparency is you know, we ask for transparency and it's clear we need more of it, right? But getting to a point where there's a balance is something that is going to be, I think, quite a challenge certainly for the initial versions of blockchain that end up in the market. The second point was security, right? So I think, so built in blockchain, at its core, it's fundamentally built on cryptography. And, you know, so that what that really means is that all of the records there's cryptography used to link them together to make sure that it essentially can't be changed, right? So once a record's written, it's linked to the previous one, and that record essentially ends up in this distributed ledger, and that process is secure by design, right? So that's, you know, not necessarily the case for the open web, for instance, right? So although you can put security on top, right, it wasn't by design from the beginning a secure protocol, and blockchains are. So that's, aside from that, there's some additional characteristics that we need to, you know, point out around whether a chain is, you know, private or open, right? The Bitcoin blockchain is open.
And
right?
That was the next point I wanted to touch on. So let's talk a little bit about what a public blockchain is versus a private blockchain. What are sort of the security and transparency sort of pros and cons of both, and how exactly does that work?
Yeah, so the private blockchain, well, I'll start with the public blockchain. So public blockchain is very much like, well, obviously Bitcoin is a public blockchain. The characteristics of that, you can think a little bit about that as just very similar to the open web in the sense that anyone can access it if they have the right, you know, tools. The private blockchains are much more like an intranet in the sense that there's some kind of control over who can see it and what they can see, right? And private blockchains are necessary, and you know, as a CTO, a lot of my conversations with my engineers are, you know, are we really using blockchain in its purest form, right? Because the purest form of blockchains is an open. And the reason why I think private blockchains are even a conversation, right, in industries, particularly in finance, are that if we want to make some kind of transition from what we have today, which is very centralized, right, you need to be able to represent roughly what you have today and move away from that, rather than just trying to insert this, you know, brand new open public blockchain. So the way we use private blockchain is essentially to establish trust as a first step, right, with our customers, so they see that we're not sharing information that they don't want us to share. And there's also another point about private blockchains which are important. There's the Bitcoin blockchain takes a lot of resources to run, and it's distributed across a vast array of machines around the globe. And in order to get to that scale, get to that kind of implementation, you need to make sure that the economics behind the whole thing work, right? And so far, there hasn't been as many kind of real-world use cases that have lent themselves well to just a full open blockchain from day one.
So my question then, as a follow-up, is how do you move from here to there? So like, we also had a similar discussion in the programmatic panel this morning about people clinging to sort of private deals. So publishers like having the security of being able to control who's bidding on their top inventory, and advertisers like to have control of where their ads end up. But how do you move from this more like very secure space? You can't obviously open it all at once. how do you get there? Is there some kind of like interim step?
Yeah, so the way we look at that is we start with a private blockchain and we'll go distributed, right? And that distribution, and I think this is not necessarily dissimilar from other approaches. We go decentralized, right? In the sense that we can work with our early customers and our early partners, customers being buyers and sellers, right? So, think of an agency or an advertiser as an opportunity to be a customer of ours, and obviously a publisher who's selling inventory in the exchange, right? They can run a node on the chain and they can have access to all of their information directly, right? And, all of the information that related to their transactions directly. As we build trust, as make sure that we're proliferating that trust amongst the network. Additionally, we can also give access to partners either who are providing data or maybe providing verification services or something in essentially in the full end-to-end transaction that we're enabling on our exchange. So the way we see that is that as the industry gets more knowledgeable and gets more capable to run these nodes and to have access directly to the blockchain, that's how we start to proliferate the tech. Now there is another potential way of doing that, and that requires a more crypto economics approach, which would be to design joint incentives between all the parties. Right, and that one's a bit more difficult because that requires collaboration from a large portion of the industry to agree to some kind of standards or some kind of tokenization concept, which is, we're so early in advertising that is not really happening right now, but that's one of the central things that we're thinking about as part of the IAB working group. So how we can bring current players to the table as well as buyers and sellers and consumers, which we don't talk about enough, into the mix.
And on kind of the same tone of expanding the blockchain, you mentioned at the very beginning just now, if I'm not mistaken, beyond trading just contracts, which is what you do, into like actual ad delivery, because as I understand, like the benefit of the blockchain is that you can really transparently follow all of these trades. And now, for me, it seems like there's almost like a hole there if you're not using the blockchain for like actual ad delivery as well. So how do you see this working in the future?
Well, so there is a hole, and the hole exists because the transaction speed of blockchains is very low in comparison to RTB today. So RTB, I think it's somewhere in the region of 4 trillion QPS globally, right? And that's just not even close to what a blockchain is capable of dealing with today. So there are ways to engage with a blockchain where it's not necessarily recording every transaction in RTB, right? Some superset of that, or it's linked to a blockchain where it's securing it, but it's not necessarily doing it at runtime, right? So that's the gap today exists in that the technology is relatively new for that use case, right? So and that's why a lot of the players are currently focused on a subset of the market, whether it be out of home or TV or some kind of smaller use case. So where I think we can get much more speed into purpose-built blockchains, right? Because the current ones that are running and have got traction have all been focused around cryptocurrencies, and that's not necessarily the same use case as us. But in the interim, I think the way to look at this is that if the current parties that are involved in the value exchange between buyer and seller, right? So that's the delivery systems, it's the verification services, so on and so forth, can start writing this information and securing it with blockchains, right? Then, as we get the speed improvements, we can start to see the more direct use at runtime for all impressions. So we do have, now that's probably best to, that's it.
I just wanted to bring it back a little bit to the industry itself. So who right now is leading the adoption of blockchain on the whole in the advertising industry? So from the advertiser side and the publisher side, and if this is not happening quite yet, like who do you see being really like the early adopters of this technology?
So we do see interest from both sides. I think it's fair to say that there's a lot of R&D going on inside certainly the big holding companies and large brands, especially in the US. I can't talk much about Europe at this point. We've been so heavily focused on US that I don't really have the knowledge there yet. But big brands, because they see a way to engage directly with with the consumer. And as we haven't talked much about this yet, but there's a use case for the identity of a user or UNI on the web to be stored in a wallet-style concept, right, where transfer of value can come directly to UNI as opposed to through an intermediary. Because of that, it's possible that, and advertisers certainly see the opportunity to start to engage directly with the consumer through that concept. So that's a lot of where the use cases, where they're leaning in. So the biggest brands are coming to us and asking, the questions, particularly around that. The holding companies, I think that they've been pushed a little bit by their customers, by the big brands, to make sure that they're at least engaging with the current platforms to see whether there's value there. But it's still, I would say, we're still only really maybe a year or two into to the first companies doing anything real that's in production, right? So it's still very early. Moving to the publisher side, I think there are one step behind, I would say. Certainly in the US, although because they have for the last few years had lots of challenges with intermediaries essentially taking out value in between the buy and the sell, they do see an opportunity to make that more transparent and ultimately get a higher yield through the value chain. So that's where the big media conglomerates are leaning into us.
So I guess I have a follow-up question to that, since most of our audience is generally from digital brands, which are not enormous holding companies by a long shot. How far away are we from having this be something that digital brands, even like the larger ones, can benefit from?
Well, I think it's going to be a few years before there's benefit across the ecosystem. I would say there's pockets where the benefit will come quicker, right? So. Particularly, there's a couple of initiatives inside in the US where current activities like ads.txt and various other kind of tag and various other current supply chain initiatives are already in place where blockchain versions of that can come along. I also think that so I would expect that to happen in the next year or two. I mean, we're only just coming out of our release of our first version, right? And I mean, we're not by any means the leader of the pack in terms of releasing a product, but I feel like we are further along in the sense that we've got traction from big companies. So I think as we get down to the kind of next year or two, we'll start to see these pockets of these use cases that essentially get traction, and as they do get traction, there's they'll see progress, and ultimately, I think we'll get some value back out from this initiative. The challenge, one of the challenges at the moment, is that there's a lot of kind of the technology being forced upon a problem rather than like looking at a problem and seeing whether the technology can help. Right? There's a lot of that going on because there's a lot of hype. Yeah. So it's a little bit challenging to pick out for companies the ones that are actually doing something useful with something new rather than just bringing a new thing, a new shiny object.
Just
and
saying blockchain, right. Use it.
Yeah.
So before we run out of time, I really want to open up the audience for questions. Does anyone have a question about blockchain that they're burning and dying to ask? All the way in the back. Excellent. Mic runner?
Hi. I was just wondering, how do you see blockchain moving into the realm of real-time ad bidding? And also, how do you think it can play a role in reducing ad fraud and programmatic advertising?
I'll tackle I'll tackle the last one first. So I think reducing ad fraud, I think giving transparency into the supply chain through recording the verification steps that need to happen is absolutely one of the first opportunities for blockchain. The challenge with that, based on your first question, is that it can't run as fast as RTB can today. So I think there has to be a good interconnect and interoperability between the current delivery architecture we have around RTB and a kind of and the blockchain. And essentially, there's essentially ways to secure that information on a blockchain, but not have to write to it in the speeds that are needed around RTB. And that's a lot of where the companies that are engaged in the market today are focused. Essentially, they're just think about it as just, they're running transactions for a few minutes, and then they're summarizing those transactions and recording them in the chain, so they don't have to worry about the speed. So that I think will happen very soon, and that's actually, frankly, the way we'll process it. We're a little bit different because we have a forward market, and that forward market means that our transactions happen, every few minutes, not every, not tens of thousands per second. So we don't have that constraint. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Do we have any other questions from the audience? We have Marco in the back with a mic.
So in the programmatic ecosystem, today you have direct programmatic, and there are initiatives in RTB 3.0 where impressions are going to be signed, and there are other things that is happening as part of the standardization. So who's going to fix the problem first? Do you think RTB 3.0 or 4.0 will be further down the line than a blockchain-enabled, transparent supply ecosystem?
So, inside the IAB, I'm co-chairing the blockchain working group, and that working group sees across all of the other initiatives inside the tech lab inside the IAB. So, I would say that 3.0 is going to solve it first, right? That's a standard specific to RTB. Right? This what we're talking about here is value transfer across the full ecosystem, right? So blockchains are larger than just the one delivery mechanism, right? There's still, in our vision for this, there's more to cater for in a transaction than just that delivery mechanism, right? So I would say that RTB, I think, there's probably that it's going to end up coming back to incentives, right? So I haven't talked about it nearly enough, but having a joint incentive inside this network is a critical part of what blockchain brings to the table. It's never really been capable before. Like having this kind of joint incentive between the consumer or essentially the user who's transiting the web, a publisher who's creating content, and capital, which is basically an advertiser. Having that joint incentive to transact directly, right, in a trusted way, is critical. And so if you think back to the question, right, RTB is just one way of transactional value coming from a buyer and a seller. The user consumer is not even considered in that picture today, right? So that's where I think you'll see the blockchain start to get installed at that level, not at the delivery level, right? It's much more about the transfer of value between those parties.
I think if we have one more question, we'd have time for it. You, sir, in the middle.
You mentioned that the blockchain allows these direct interactions a lot. In an ideal case, if some blockchain project cracks the code and they really work very well in what they try to deliver, do you think there still is a place for networks and media companies, given that the exact trusted function that they have will then not be necessary anymore?
I do think there's a place. I think the role changes significantly, though. So it was required in order to bring forward the innovation we've had over the last many years. It was required that somebody stood up and said, "Okay, I'm going to assist you or I to engage with the web." Right? And the value transfer through those intermediaries today there's still some very good use cases why you engage with those companies. Right? Still providing value. Right? It's a very utopian view to say that I am going to be able to manage, curate my data and get value back for it, right? That's a 5 to 10 year vision, right? It's not something that's going to happen tomorrow. But in absence of a technology to enable that, it never happened, right? And that's what, back to this peer-to-peer relationship that the internet was born around, that's really what blockchain promises to technically enable. So I think the intermediaries stay, but their role changes. Their role changes, they start to provide services and added value on top of that. And it's yet to be seen what that added value really is, but I still believe there's a subset of the ecosystem that will never quite get to that direct transfer of value because they just don't care enough, right?
Guys, I think that's all the time we have for questions. We're running a bit over time, but Richard, thank you so much for coming all the way from New York. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.